Rama Rama Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama Hare Hare. Concerning some discussion last night about a verse in the Bhagavatam, chapter 10, text 9. Which reads, Ekam ekat tarabhave yada nopa labamahe triyatam tatrayo veda sa atma svasprayasraya. So the translation is, all the above mentioned 3 stages of different living entities are interdependent. So the 3 stages of living entities, 3 levels, was discussed as Adhyatmic person, Adhidaivic person, and Adhibautic person. So the Adhyatmic person is the one that's being controlled by the Adhidaivic person, the demigods. And the body that they have is the Adhibautic person. Usually Adhyatmic, Adhidaivic, and Adhibautic are discussed a little differently in terms of threefold miseries, because they do pertain to the material body, mind, and senses. So Adhyatmic usually refers to miseries from one's own body and mind. And Adhidaivic usually refers to miseries inflicted by the demigods, such as storms, droughts, wind, rain, excessive heat, excessive cold. And the Adhibautic person is the one that the Adhibautic miseries are caused by other living entities. That's how they usually, or we're used to seeing them discussed. But here, they're discussed a little differently. The individual person possessing instruments of senses is the Adhyatmic person, mind and senses. The controlling deity of those senses is the Adhidaivic person, the demigods. And the embodiment is called the Adhibautic person, the one that's subject to miseries by other living entities. So those are the 3 stages. And then that verse last night was the above mentioned 3 stages of living entities are interdependent. In the absence of one, the other is not understood. And the Supreme Being, who is seeing every one of them as the shelter of the shelter, is independent of all, therefore is the Supreme Shelter. So I was marveling at how, and in the purport, Prabhupada discusses these interdependencies, like he says, there innumerable living entities are dependent on the other in the relationship of controlled and controller. But without the medium of perception, no one can understand who is the controlled and who is the controller. For example, the sun controls the power of our vision, and we can see the sun because the sun has its body, and the sunlight is useful only because we have eyes. Without having eyes, the sunlight is useless. Without sunlight, the eyes are useless. Thus, they are interdependent. Neither of them is independent. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna. So, who is independent? Is there anyone independent? That is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So I was marveling at how, looking around, what we see in the world, perceive, and becoming aware of the interdependence of everyone and everything on everyone else and everything else, that the proof of the existence of the Supreme Independent, that the Supreme Being, the cause of all causes, is supremely independent. Because he's the cause of it all. Therefore, he's not interdependent. He's not on that level of interdependency. He's completely independent. But I had a question about the second part of the verse. The first part, all living entities are interdependent. Okay. In the absence of one, the other is not understood. In other words, like that old thing, if a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? So, if there's sunlight but there's no eyes anywhere to perceive the sunlight, then what's the use of the sunlight? And similarly, if there were eyes but there's no sunlight or no light, actually all light is coming from the sun, even if you light a fire or if you use electricity. Those are stored up forms of the sun's energy. Whatever you're burning, wood, coal, petroleum, whatever it is, it's stored up sunlight. Like, say it's wood. Well, the wood was a tree that captured sunlight, stored it up in the form of wood. And when you ignite it, it releases that stored up energy of the sun. Similarly with electricity, however it's produced. Hydroelectric power plants. That's the water, and it's related to the rains. The rains are related to the sun, evaporate. Anyway, it's actually all stored up. All light is stored up. Sunlight, sun's energy stored up one way or another, and then released at a later date. So without sunlight, in one form or another, what good are the eyes? You can't see anything. It's darkness. So the interdependent. So, okay, I can get the first part. The living entities are interdependent. The absence of one, the other's not understood. But the second part, the Supreme Being who is perceiving every one of them as the shelter of the shelter, is independent. So where does this come from? Shelter. Like, how does it go from the first part of the verse, interdependent, to then talking about shelter? So that was my question. And the answer was okay. It was a nice discussion. We looked up the word shelter in the Oxford Dictionary and we quoted Shakespeare, and we went all different ways with it. But I'm looking at it this morning and I'm seeing that dependent means dependent on someone else. So that someone else, by depending on them, is the shelter. If I depend on someone, I'm taking shelter of them to one degree or another. So if I have eyes to see, I'm taking shelter of the sunlight. That's why worshiping the demigods, worshiping Surya, giving sunlight so I can see. It's the idea behind demigods, I think. Demigod worship. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. So I'm seeing the key to understanding how to go from interdependent to the shelter of all shelters is because dependency means taking shelter of someone else. So the Supreme Being, if that had come out, just that simple connection of dependency and shelter, if that had come out in the discussion, that would have turned everything, at least for me. Oh, okay, I get it. But it kind of, everybody danced around it a little bit and didn't really hit it right on the noggin. But now this morning, I think that's what I needed to be able to understand why in this discussion Krishna is referred to as the shelter of all shelters. We know the cause of all causes is referred to sarva karana karanam. Well, here he's referred to as ashraya ashraya, shelter of all shelters. So that helped. The ultimate source of all interdependence is Supersoul, who's not dependent on anything else. Swa ashraya ashraya. He's only dependent on himself. Therefore, he's the supreme shelter of everything. Cause of all causes, shelter of all shelters. So that's by looking around us and seeing how everyone's dependent on someone else in so many different ways. But the supreme shelter, the cause of all causes, is Krishna. So it makes sense to make that connection with Krishna. Just like we can see from things in the world, everyone serving someone. That ties in with dependency. You're serving someone, you're dependent on them if you're serving them. You're serving them, you're dependent on them in some way or other. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna. So, but everyone is actually a servant of Krishna. So, servant of the servant of the servant of the servant. When you begin to cultivate the Krishna consciousness, you see how it's actually servant of the servant of the servant of the servant of the servant. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna. So the shelter of the shelter of the shelter of the shelter. The cause of all of the cause of the cause of the cause of the cause. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna. Yeah, I wish that had come out. Just that simple link with dependent. It would have opened it up, at least for me. Oh, that's how we go from the first part of the verse about interdependent to shelter of all shelters. That's how we go from there in the verse, the first part of the verse and then the second part. But it didn't really come out. We just danced around it. Didn't really strike the gong. Bye. Krishna. All right. Chaitanya.